Welcome, everyone. I'm Gabriella Gallagher, National Chair of Canadian Friends of Peace Now. Our organization is the Canadian partner to Peace Now, Shalom Ashav, which is Israel's leading peace movement and which promotes the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can find out more about us on our website, peacenowcanada.org. We really hope you will consider supporting us with a donation, which you can do via our website. Just go to the donate page. We rely entirely on donations from people like you. Later on, we will have time for audience questions. Please type those at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please make your question as concise as you can so that we have time for as many questions as possible. If you like, please include where you're from. Our webinar is being recorded and posted to our website, and will be posted to our website. Our moderator today is my fellow board member, David Cohen from Montreal. Today marks 100 days since the hostages were kidnapped into Gaza during the horrific attack by Hamas on October 7th. Our hearts go out to their families, and we join the many calls to bring the hostages home. We are extremely honored to have as our special guest today, Dalia Scheindlin. She's an accomplished political scientist, public opinion expert, political consultant, and she's also an author. Her latest book is The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled. It's available on Amazon and through her publisher, and I will send out the information about that publisher a little later. Dalia is originally from Canada, but has lived in Israel for many years. There's an awful lot more to say about her, but let's get right into the webinar. So David, over to you. David, pardon me, over to you.
Thank you, Gabriella. So I'm very pleased to be the panelist asking questions to Dalia Scheindlin. So let's start with the first question. Could you please start by updating us on the status of the Israel-Hamas war? For example, has the fighting become any less intense? What is the trend in terms of loss of civilian and military lives on both sides? So let's start with that.
Thank you. And first of all, welcome to everybody. Also, thank you for hosting me to both organizations, Peace Now and NIF as a partner. The update is difficult. The IDF did announce something like the beginning of a drawdown of forces in the beginning of January, and officials told us that Israel is moving into a somewhat less intense phase of the war. Having said that, and where we are in terms of the status of the war is that Israel's forces have essentially taken over the entire north of Gaza. That's the area where people have been evacuated, most of them, to the south. The IDF has been moving into the central regions, but there have also been plenty of attacks in the south of Gaza. And that's part of the reason why we see a dispute over the safety of civilians. The casualty rate is grim. We're looking at what is estimated, according to Gazan sources, we're looking at the Ministry of Health estimations of over 23,000 people, possibly over 24,000, but that doesn't include estimates of up to 7,000 who are missing. The assumption is that they're buried under the buildings that have been destroyed, and that is a huge number of buildings. I mean, much of Gaza City has been completely destroyed. And so the problem with this is that, in some ways, when you ask about the pace of deaths, certainly on the Gazan side, it's hard to keep an exact toll of the trend. We've been hearing these numbers of 23,000 to 24,000 for the last roughly week and a half. So it could be that the pace of casualties on the Palestinian side is slowing somewhat, but that also doesn't take into account the number of people who are simply missing. Of course, a large portion of those, estimated at around 8,000 people by IDF sources, are Hamas fighters, that's what, like, again, according to Israeli officials, and it's, I always have to kind of take into account that who is saying these things and what are the sources, because of all these numbers can fall under dispute. On the Israeli side, almost every day there are soldiers who are being killed, usually in small numbers, 1, 2, but over the weekend there were, or maybe it was late last week already, there were, 9 or 10 who were killed within the space of about 2 days. And that has to do with either battle deaths or also things like accidents. There was one of the larger casualty events last week for Israeli soldiers was when there was firing near a lot of ammunition that set off explosions from the ammunition, and that killed, I think it was 6 or 7 people. And so we're also trying to keep tabs on the number of Israeli soldiers who are killed through what we call in English friendly fire, what we call in Hebrew two-sided fire, but essentially firing from Israel's own forces. So there are casualties. I think we're getting close to about 200 Israeli soldiers who have been killed since the start of the war in Gaza, especially the ground operation. That, of course, doesn't take into account several hundred soldiers who were killed on October 7th. We also had 2 Israelis killed today on the northern border. And, I don't want to go on and on with this first question, but it's important to say that the status of the Israel-Hamas war doesn't cover the status of military hostilities entirely, because the northern border has been very tense. There has been an exchange of fire, including an escalation just today that killed 2 Israelis after firing anti-tank missiles from the north. And so there is a very high level of anticipation, expectation, and concern that the northern border will move from something like a low-level military exchange into something like a full-blown war. There are voices in Israel calling for a first strike, but either way, there is certainly a likelihood that that war will escalate. Then there's also what's happening in the Red Sea, of course, the Houthi attacks from Yemen, and just over the last 2 days, the response of America and the US with other countries supporting the attacks on the Houthis. That is also a knockoff effect of this war. And the West Bank. Okay, the West Bank has been also a violent front that is barely under control, but that's because several hundred Palestinians have been killed there by ongoing Israeli raids and an attempt to ensure that the fighting doesn't spread in a full-blown way, leading to ongoing lower-level violence and military mini escalations, I would say, all the time. But there is also a grave concern that there will be something like a more extensive escalation in the West Bank as well. And I think the last point I just want to make about that is that the consensus seems to be that the general aim that the government has set out as its military aim, which is destroying Hamas's military and governing capacity, is something that by this point, most Israeli military analysts think was not sufficiently defined. And therefore, there's no real end sight. So even if we can talk about drawing down somewhat, or maybe a slightly slower scale of destruction, the fact is that the forecast is that this war will go on for a long time. We heard Netanyahu, in the face of the hearings at the International Court of Justice just on Thursday and Friday, say that Israel is not planning to stop this war.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, please tell us about the effect the October 7 massacre and the ensuing war have had on both Israeli and Palestinian societies. What is your perception of the current mood in Israel regarding the future of Gaza?
Yeah, I think that for one thing, we should keep in mind there are some very immediate effects that we can see in the public mood. Not all of them bad, by the way. One of the most striking aspects of what's happened in Israel is an enormous civilian mobilization, where civilians really instantly and pretty much through to the present organized and mobilized donation efforts and efforts to help absorb people who were evacuated from the north and the south, and volunteer and get all sorts of goods and supplies together for soldiers who were being recruited for reserves, but also the evacuees themselves. And so there is a great sense of sort of social resilience among the civilian population. So it's not all bad. I want to start with that good news. But of course, I think the great and overwhelming mood is one of shock, and it's shock that is so big that it simply has changed form over time. So in the first 2 weeks to a month, I would say, people were, I think, literally dazed, honestly, barely could finish a thought. Nobody could think of anything else. People were still scrambling to figure out what had happened. Who did they know who had been either, killed, kidnapped, wounded, assaulted, but also simply people who experienced, even if they emerged unscathed from either, the Nova Music Festival or from one of the kibbutzim. The circles of trauma go so far beyond. Just to give you an example, I know somebody from kibbutz Be'eri in the south. This is one of the kibbutzim that was the hardest hit. About 10% of their people were killed. And he himself was fine. He lives in Tel Aviv. His parents live on the kibbutz. They were okay, but their house was completely gutted, destroyed by fire. And he basically was communicating that 100 people he knows are dead. And so I think until you kind of internalize that that's somebody who is theoretically not even counted among the victims, and yet just lost 100 personal acquaintances, this is still a society in shock, and it will be a long time until we understand all the ramifications. We have to remember that the regular rhythm of life has been disrupted. The academic school year was completely pushed off and only began on January 1st. We're talking about the fall semester. That means lots of people have to shift their schedules. The economy has been severely slowed, and definitely for the first phase, many businesses were shut. Of course, small business owners, many of them are recruited into reserve duty, so there's economic pressure on people. There's also a grave sense of fear, and that's leading to large numbers of people, several 100,000, for example, who've been requesting gun licenses. So there's all these concentric circles of the impact on Israeli society. And I think in addition to those behaviors that we're talking about, civilian mobilization, civilian fear, people dealing with their traumas or trying to help people who are evacuated, there's also the political level, which is that beyond party politics, the most common word that I hear Israelis saying beyond their fury at Hamas, I mean, the obvious thing is that people, are devastated by what Hamas did, but in the very same breath, sometimes even before they talk about Hamas, the first word on people's lips is abandonment. We were abandoned. And there is a very strong sense that they've been abandoned by the state and by this government. Again, it kind of crosses party politics. We see that in survey research, and I can talk about that further. Let me stop here for Israeli society just to say that there's certainly much more we can talk about for the longer term ramifications. In terms of Palestinian society, it's far more extreme in a way. And this is not to play competition of victimhood, which I think nobody should be doing, frankly, at this point. But the fact is that the vast portion of Gazans have been displaced. About 80% of Gazans are displaced right now. There are, by various accounts, about a quarter who are at risk of immediate starvation, don't have access to food and water. I mean, you have somewhere between international organizations and survey research showing that anywhere between a quarter, but maybe many more people don't have access to food and water, and of course, regular supplies. So they're living in really abject conditions. Many humanitarian workers say they've never seen anything like it. We know they're facing, rampant threat of disease, particularly things like cholera, or because they don't have supplies for normal hygiene. Hospitals have been devastated. The health services have been completely gutted. They lack normal. I don't want to get too graphic, but you can imagine that this is this is something that almost all Gazans will experience because they can't have access to regular medicine, let alone medical treatment, let alone treatment for wounds. The deaths are so vast that they have barely any way to cope with those. And in the West Bank, I think that they are living under something like lockdown, because the mobilization of the IDF and the regular ongoing raids and like I said, sort of a low-level military operations every day mean that many of the roads are closed, cities are locked down. There have been new gates built around Ramallah, one of the major Palestinian cities in the West Bank. So people are finding it very hard to move, which means they can't carry out their normal economic and social and family life, which exacerbates their own sense of uncertainty, tension, and they're also coping with, first of all, their anguish over what's happening in Gaza. Many of these are the same families, the same communities. It's been a mistake for a long time to try to look at the West Bank and Gaza as if they were some sort of separate problems. These are contiguous societies, even if they're not geographically contiguous. And so there's a lot of anxiety, fear about for their communities in Gaza, and I think also a lot of very difficult feelings about what happened on October 7th. I mean, we've seen survey research showing that Palestinians, by a large majority, support what happened, but there are great differences in how they understand what happened. And then immediately it kind of transformed into anguish over and horror over what was happening, what the devastation that the war was doing in Gaza. So all of those things are going into the mix. And I think we're seeing, again, it's hard to even, I don't want to overstate the case, but I think the trauma that each individual in these societies and collectively that each society is experiencing, it can't be measured in months, years. It will be generations. This will become part of kind of the identity of each society, each understood in its own way.
Okay, you are an expert on polls, and perhaps you can provide us some insight about what the reactions are in Gaza and the West Bank in terms of the perception of Hamas attack, and whether they agree with it or whether they are horrified about
So
it.
starting with the Palestinians, I should
Yes,
work on,
please.
yeah,
Yes.
I mean, so it's like I started to mention, I mean, there isn't a lot of survey research, right? We have essentially I would say 2.5 major surveys that have come out. One is from Birzeit University, and that's called the Arab World Research and Development Survey. The other major one is from PSR, or Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. That's run by Dr. Khalil Shikaki. I should mention that he is a colleague. I do joint Israeli-Palestinian survey research together with him over the years. And the other one, I call it a half survey because it was a survey just of Palestinians in the West Bank. Now, all of these surveys are pretty consistent, certainly the ones with the full sample of Gazans and people from the West Bank. And I know I'm going to get questions, so I will preempt this about how anybody could do survey research in Gaza when the population is sort of devastated at wartime and dislocated, displaced. And I think that, I'm happy to get into it, but let's just say I wouldn't be analyzing surveys if I wasn't convinced that they had as rigorous as possible a methodology for reaching those people, even as they are displaced and living in camps and tents. And these are pretty robust samples, and they've made their methodology transparent. So like I said, support for Hamas is in some ways higher than it ever was, but there are different ways of looking at this because there's different questions that are asked. Would you vote for Hamas? Would you vote for Hamas in the parliamentary election? Would you vote for the Hamas candidate in a presidential election? Who do you want to run the Gaza Strip afterwards? And I can say that Hamas certainly got an enormous lift after October 7th. And you have to understand that before October 7th, the Arab Barometer survey, that is a long-running survey of different Arab communities and countries in the region, they had just completed their survey research of the Palestinian territories on October 6th, and they published the analysis and findings a few weeks later. And Hamas was doing very poorly. Now, Hamas and Fatah both do pretty poorly over the years. Palestinians are essentially experiencing a leadership crisis for a long time. And the reason they're experiencing a leadership crisis is partly because they are, authoritarian and corrupt and have not, served their people in ways governments normally are expected to, and because they haven't made any progress in achieving Palestinian independence, liberation from Israeli occupation, or improvements of their lives as that they hope would result from that. And so both parties were actually running kind of in parity. They both were in somewhere in the low 30% range on average in surveys in recent years. And now Hamas is doing much better now. That's a typical pattern whenever there's a war between Israel and Hamas, but Hamas is doing particularly better this time. Okay, so I think that needs to be understood that Hamas is seen by Palestinians as the actor that changed the balance, that showed that the Palestinians could be as powerful as Israel, that that Hamas could put Palestinians back on the map. And for the first time in years, you have all these Western governments now talking about reviving a peace process, or maybe even reviving Palestinian statehood. I'm not saying Israelis are listening, or the Israeli government, but from the Palestinian perspective, Hamas was able to achieve things in terms of getting the world to pay attention to them, particularly the plight in Gaza, that nobody else had been able to do. And part of this is because when the PA and the Palestinian Authority, led by Fatah, over the years was open to negotiations, Israel wasn't interested in negotiations. We had a prime minister who actively wanted to avoid negotiations, definitely wanted to avoid a two-state solution, and did everything he could to diminish Fatah and diminish their sense of achievements, leading to both a stalemate, but also helping to keep Hamas in power in a way. And now Palestinians see that Hamas is able to kind of change the equation. So they have been more supportive. They also haven't been seeing the same kinds of images of what happened on October 7th. The same surveys that I'm talking about show that about 85% of Palestinians have not seen videos of the atrocities on October 7th, and they think it was the right thing to do. And so these are very pessimistic observations, but they're also it reflects the fact that everybody's filtering it through what they want to understand out of what happened. Israelis also, there's been a lot of talk about how Israelis are not showing, for example, the civilian devastation in Gaza. It might be one of the reasons why Israelis don't understand why so many other countries in the world think that Israel's doing something terrible, because they just aren't really confronting it themselves visually, graphically, or emotionally day in, day out. And Israelis very much support the war. So put it this way, before the 7th of October, both sides were at an absolute low point in terms of trust in one another, in terms of openness to one another, and in terms of support for militant approaches. Now we're seeing that come to fruition, and both sides are becoming even more militant. So that's how I would analyze Palestinian opinion. I would say one last thing about Palestinian public opinion in general. It's not a free society, right? This is not an open democracy where people necessarily feel openly comfortable talking about their views, but we do see trends over time. So we know that people are responding to events on the ground through surveys. But I will say that at wartime, and especially under Hamas, which is authoritarian and theocratic and violent, I think you have to take into account that it's people's range of ideas, the kinds of things that people feel comfortable thinking about and talking about well before surveys come into the question, is much more limited, because you have a much more constrained environment in general. And that's also part of the picture when trying to understand Palestinian public opinion, especially during wartime.
But how about the polls in the West Bank? It seems that in the West Bank, they have access to those pictures, and they seem to have the mood has shifted in favor of, it seems, of Hamas. What's your view on that? The West Bank.
Well, first of all, I would say both sides have access to pictures if they want to. I mean, all of the videos and all of the videos from either Hamas body cams or from victims or from Israeli sources, they're all available online. Anybody who wants to see them can. And it's the same with Israelis who maybe aren't seeing the pictures of devastation of civilians in Gaza. All of this stuff is available if people go searching for it, including Gaza, Gazan Palestinians. But you raise a very important point, which is that Hamas, for all that I said that people can feel constrained, I should say that even in surveys, it's very clear that despite the fact that there's been a boost for Hamas overall, it's much stronger in the West Bank. In Gaza, the differences are striking. Now, there's always been, in recent years, more support for Hamas in the West Bank, right? In other words, Hamas isn't taking the blame for governance in the West Bank. They're not living under a Hamas regime, so it looks better than their corrupt authoritarian leaders, Fatah and the PA. But the gap between how much lower support is for Hamas in Gaza versus the West Bank is particularly significant now. And more, what I found very striking about some of the data is that the questions about who would you vote for in a parliamentary election or presidential election showed Hamas winning as usual and getting the winning. As usual during wartime. That's when Hamas gets its boost. Still stronger in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. But then when they added a different kind of question, something that took people out of their normal paradigm of thinking about this stuff, and the question was, who do you prefer would rule Gaza on the day after this war? In the West Bank, about 75% of people said Hamas. And in Gaza, that was like 38%. In other words, the gap was enormous on that particular question. Yeah. I'm speculating as a public opinion researcher that it's because this was a different kind of question and people didn't have such a stock answer ready, and they probably answered more truthfully.
Okay, good. So let's go to the next question. Some leaders, such as the Foreign Affairs European Union chief, Mr. Borrell, talk about an imposed solution, and some Arab and Palestinian leaders talk about proposing Hamas as part of the future governance of the territories. All demand from Israel a commitment to a two-state solution. Can the international community, and the US in particular, impose a solution on both Israel and the Palestinians?
Yeah, I was very interested to see about 2 weeks ago that the European Union High Representative Joseph Borrell said that that it's time for the international community to impose a solution. I mean, it's a tricky question, right? Israel is a sovereign state and it will make its own decisions, but it is not formally the sovereign over the Palestinian territories, and that's why this is an international question. But go tell that to Israelis, because the Israeli government has been a little bit confused in recent years, and they seem to think that they are sovereign over the West Bank and Gaza. They say, well, we're not in control when it doesn't suit us, but we are in control when it suits us. So it gets very complicated. I think that the international community, when we say the international community, let's be honest, very often we are talking about Western countries led by America, and not only Western countries, but Western European, the Western countries of Western Europe. And again, with America being the most powerful, and America and the UK kind of taking the lead. I mean, when we say international community, we have to think about who we really mean. So can America impose a solution? Absolutely, except America won't. Okay, America can, however, move the bar. America has more leverage than any of those countries that I just mentioned. And it has that leverage because it is Israel's most stalwart ally over decades, and particularly during this war at a time when I think Israel is facing unprecedented global pressure, even from some of its close allies. Although, so far I think it's been really America, the UK, Germany, as we saw a few days ago, that just joined Israel's side as amicus to the international court, the case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. So these are stalwart allies, and the Western European countries are also generally expressing very supportive views of Israel. And having said that, I know that they are also, well, I mean, we see their public statements, they're also reiterating their commitment to something like a long-term diplomatic solution based on a two-state solution. The question is whether they will actually make a concerted effort driven by policy from their own countries to try to move the parties there. When you ask about impose, frankly, I think it's like I said, possible but unlikely. And the more likely scenario is that those countries can push the parties closer. Now, I don't want to fall into the trap of saying international community when we're only actually referring to the US and Western Europe, right? There are lots of other countries out there, and they're very important. So I think there is definitely a role for the Arab countries, and they're of course not monolithic either. One of the most important actors will be Saudi Arabia. By all accounts, it seems like Saudi Arabia still plans to still is open to advancing normalization with Israel, but by all accounts will demand that Israel make some sort of effort to actually reach a resolution based on a Palestinian statehood. And I guess the question becomes, are we back to where we were on October 6th, where Israel was simply playing a cost-benefit game of how much is it willing to move in terms of concessions to the Palestinians in order to get that great big prize of normalization with Saudi Arabia? And it's the same basic dilemma, but the stakes maybe have changed and the price may be somewhat different. In fact, the price might be higher, right? It could be that before October 7th, Israel would have had to make some small steps that it could probably fudge. And Saudi would have said, okay, fine, it's enough for us. Now it may be much more serious. So that, I think that I'm going to go back to what I've said again. Some of this repeats analyses that I held before October 7th, which is that it will take the perfect storm. It will take numerous international actors. Another possibility is that this war ends with a Security Council resolution, like so many other wars in the world, like Israel's last war with Lebanon. We see what it's worth because that hasn't been held to very well. But if there's a Security Council resolution, well, you'll need to get the US on board, or at least, not to veto it. You'll need to get Russia to somehow agree with the US position, or at least not completely contradict it. So these are all countries that have an enormous impact on what will eventually happen. But I think that it will take a perfect storm of numerous countries taking just the right positions, whatever those positions are, that in a way complement each other to give both. It will have to be a combination of pressure and incentives, but I'd like to think that there is sufficient, that that ending the war would be a sufficient incentive for both sides if they had their their main concerns taken care of. But they're going to be up against a very severe challenge inside Israel. I mean, I've written about this. I have a whole article devoted to the gap in perceptions in Israel. When you talk about a two-state solution now, the vast majority of Israelis, they just think you're coming from another planet, and they don't understand why the world. They either don't understand why other countries are talking about it, or they're just not even hearing the words because it seems so remote here right now.
Okay, and how about the idea of Hamas being part of the governance? Again, violent Hamas or non-violent Hamas, is that possible? Because it seems that many moderate Arab countries, even and the Palestinian Authority, are talking about seriously Hamas being part of the governance. What do you think?
I think that if you ask the Israeli public, they want nothing to do with it. If you ask the Israeli government publicly, they will say we will stop at nothing other than the complete and total destruction of Hamas. But the question arises, what does the complete and total destruction of Hamas mean? To what level? Remember, Hamas is deeply embedded in Palestinian, specifically Gazan society. And because it's been the functional governing power, we call the de facto power in Gaza since 2007. The elections were in 2006, the last Palestinian elections. Hamas took over Gaza by force after it essentially won the elections with a plurality of the votes in 2006, but it wasn't able to, it didn't form the coalition, and it didn't form the government, and it took over in 2007. So because Hamas has been governing ever since then, with no other national elections held, the entire public sector is essentially Hamas. So when you say we're going to destroy every last bit of Hamas, does that mean every person who's an active fighter, who's actively carrying weapons? Does it mean the clerk who staffs the reception desk in the Ministry of Health? Does it mean every teacher, in a Hamas-run school? I mean, there's no definition of this stuff. There's nobody's answering these questions. And so when the government, when the Israeli government says they want to destroy Hamas, obviously it means they don't want them to be part of any next Palestinian government, which has always been their position, by the way. And the Palestinian position has always been that, excuse me, that Hamas is part of Palestinian political life. And the question is whether they'll rejoin the PLO. And I think that this will be the negotiation, is that are there some terms that can be reached between Israel and whichever international brokers are working towards a ceasefire, by which Hamas at some level, certainly not the military level, right? Israel's not going to stop this war until it has reached its level of satisfaction with destruction of the military wing. But at what level of the civilian, wing of Hamas, the political wing of Hamas, are people allowed to, will Israel say, okay, we're not going to kill every single one of them, and they will have to be reintegrated somehow into both Palestinian civil and administrative life, and ultimately into Palestinian politics. I think that's the only possible meeting ground between Israel and the Arab countries and the PLO. But Israel's very far from getting there. Let's be honest. It's not that we're talking way far off into the future. And I think that it depends on who you ask in Israel. And nobody from the government will ever say anything like that publicly. I think, privately, when they're getting briefings from their security teams and, from their security officials, they know that that's going to be one of the options. And I think they're probably asking themselves similar questions, but I doubt if they have the answers right now.
It seems that the Israeli government has floated the idea of using the big family names, like the local tribes in Gaza, for helping them govern the various districts. Is that something that could fly?
I mean, I don't know. I think that Israel, the idea that Israel is able to manufacture, to kind of construct Palestinian politics is the wrong way of looking at it to begin with. It is not Israel that gets to decide, who is in Palestine, who governs Palestinians. It's up to Palestinians to decide. That's the kind of thinking that's led us to, all these decades of occupation. And of course, the two sides will have to come to terms, because we are mitigating a very serious, dangerous actor. But ultimately, I think the longer term view is that Israel can't always put itself in this position of saying we get to somehow construct Palestinian governance. That has to be, I mean, again, I'm not saying you're wrong. The government, the government may have this view. It may be one of the many things that's being kind of discussed all around. The other thing is, I think that for the sake of Palestinian politics, frankly, it's a rather condescending view. It's a condescending view to say, well, their politics are tribal, clan-based. I mean, it's like looking at them as some sort of primitive society. I think that, again, Palestinians will have to decide on the process for selecting a government. And the one thing I think that all actors should agree on is that Palestinians need to have a government that is representative, accountable, and unified. That's three things. Sorry, I should have said three things. Representative, accountable, and unified. If I had my way, it would be a democratic government for their sake, but it's not truly for me to decide. Having said that, I think representative, accountable, and unified already puts us on a path towards democratic governance. But the problem with prescribing or saying, I think there should be elections now is that we don't have an environment of stability and civil liberties and the kind of infrastructure that you would need to have open and serious competitive elections. There should be in the future, but it will take a while to rebuild that kind of system that it would be needed to make the elections genuine. But ultimately, these have to be Palestinian decisions. I think it's high time that Israel or some Palestinians or the rest of the world stop looking at Palestinians as people that they can kind of move around depending on somebody's interest. These are people. They need self-determination and their own choice about their leadership.
Yeah.
Provided, of course, they don't threaten their neighbors. I mean, that has to be part of the equation.
Yeah. Okay. The next question, I think you've alluded to that gap between Israelis and perhaps the rest of the world. It seems that there is this wide gap regarding the conduct of the war between, let's say, Westerners and Israelis, the violence in the West Bank, and the future governance of Gaza. Like you were talking about, Israelis not understanding when Westerners talk about, two-state solution, or also on the idea of the conduct of the war. It seems that there is a gap in the perceptions between the West and the Israeli society. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I have alluded to this. I'll bring a few points together. One is that there is a visual difference. I think people may be making a little too much of it, but it's true that the Israeli news, like I think any country at wartime, is covering the Israeli side of the story. And I don't see it as a conspiracy. It's not a matter of censorship. It's a combination of the fact that what happened on October 7th was so devastating and touched so many people and was so unprecedented and so brutal. I mean, the creativity of the cruelty was something that people are going to be, processing for so long that we're still learning more stories and details. And all of these stories are coming out and they're taking up a great deal of what normally would be news time. Now, this is news. I'm not saying it's not news, but that is consuming a great, vast amount of the public's attention and the media's attention. And that leaves a little time for other things. And the other things are the conduct of the war and the political intrigue at the top, and lots of very good investigative reporting about how we got to October 7th from the Israeli side, what were the intelligence failure, et cetera. Lots of other things that Israelis are concerned with, the global situation, the International Court of Justice. All of these things are taking up all of the airtime, or the vast majority of it. And Israeli media and commentary does not leave a lot of time to talk about, the actual levels of Palestinian suffering. So that's part of it. International sources, no matter which country you're in, generally are giving a much broader picture, whichever side they tend to fall out on. So people at least have a much bigger picture of, the Palestinian side of it, the experiences in Gaza, the devastation of the war. Israelis hear it in headlines, or they hear numbers. Or if there are items on TV, what they tend to show, and there are items, but they tend to show devastation of buildings. Okay, sort of infrastructural devastation. We don't see a lot of pictures of suffering people. So that's part of it. But the other thing is that, a lot of this is just an extreme version of the gap that's existed for long before. And that's why in some ways I say October 7th changed everything. or maybe not. Maybe it didn't change that much. There has been a gap for many years where outsiders say, doesn't Israel want to reach a peaceful final status political agreement to this conflict instead of living, with an ongoing military conflict? But Israelis don't see it like that. For years, Israelis have seen it in a completely different sort of a reverse approach. What they've said before is, well, we tried to reach peace with Palestinians in the 1990s. We tried to reach peace in the year 2000, having a very detailed negotiation over a two-state solution. And each time the Palestinians carried out suicide bombings and violence, and they didn't want it. Now, those things are true, but they're a very limited part of the fuller picture. There were lots of parts of these agreements that Israel did not uphold. There weren't even agreements. I mean, actually, there has never been a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. So when Israelis say we tried, they're not thinking about the fact that there never actually was a signed peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian leadership. This also may be a source of confusion abroad, so I want to just make a point clear. The Oslo process of the 1990s was a set of principles. It was actually the first document was called the Declaration of Principles. The other ones were called the interim agreements, and they were intended eventually to reach final status, but they never said what the final status was, leaving both sides open to, free to interpret as they see fit. Many people thought it was supposed to lead to a two-state solution, but in the Israeli kind of perspective that has been repeated for decades, we tried peace, it didn't work. We can boil it down. I think it's important to understand that there's a very different starting point, and that's what people are saying over and over again since October 7th. So those kinds of things, the long-term perspective and the immediate experience, lead to very big gaps. The other major gap, and this is really very striking to me from here because I am originally from North America. As you mentioned, I was born in Canada. I think it's worth mentioning that not only was I born in Montreal, but I am an alum of McGill. Okay, I did undergrad there. So some of my finest, probably my best years of life. You're catching me not at my best, Anyway, but I did grow up in New York, so I'm also American, and watching the debates on campuses, the general tenor of the debates among not just campuses, but in the public sphere, demonstrations, the messages of different pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel groups, they are so different from the conversations we're having here. I can tell you without having to even take a poll that the average Israeli, neither the average Israeli nor the average Palestinian, if there is such a thing on either side, is arguing the meaning of settler colonialism. Not to say they're not experiencing some version of those concepts. They can be meaningful. But the fact is that the debate in North America has become very meta. Okay, it's become very removed from the actual day-to-day experiences and severe, emergency level crises that we're dealing with on the ground. And I find that, I don't like normally to sound like I'm judging people abroad, but I think that lots of people are happy to take very firm opinions on this conflict who do not have to live with the consequences. Okay, I think, people who are able to talk about, on the one hand, Palestinians should use every military strategy at their disposal. It's not their families in Gaza, and the people who are telling Israel, keep fighting until they're all gone. They're not the ones who've been living under rocket fire for 3 months the way I have. So I think, there are reasons for this gap. People are living very different experiences, and I don't always think that people abroad are completely incorporating, taking that into account sufficiently.
Thank you.
I'm going to apologize. I have to get up, so I know it'll be a little distracting for just a minute, but I will be stable once again very soon.
Okay.
But feel free to keep asking me questions.
Okay, next question. Is this the time to strive for a comprehensive solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or should one start with incremental, concrete steps?
Oh, I think I've lost sound.
Okay, you think so? Like about the concrete steps? Have you talked about it?
I've lost my sound. Bear with me.
I can hear you. Can
Try to see. Yeah, I think you're back.
Okay.
Apologies. It's the
All
tyranny of
right.
technology. So please repeat your question.
Okay. So I said, is this the time to strive for a comprehensive solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or should one start with incremental concrete steps while keeping the vision of a comprehensive solution on the horizon for the longer term? Like this is what the Americans are talking about.
Yeah. Okay. I would say, first of all, nothing can happen until there's a ceasefire.
Yeah.
There is no horizon for anything until the fighting stops. When and how that happens, I mean, I would like for it to happen sooner rather than later. I would like for it to happen yesterday. Personally, I've called for a ceasefire. I think there are a number of reasons why we should have a ceasefire, but the Israeli government has not been listening to me and is not paying attention to me. And there are, other, again, I mean, I don't want to minimize the fact that this is that Hamas has proven itself to be an active and actual danger. I think the word threat sometimes makes it sound like it's something in the future. This is an active, military conflict, and we shouldn't minimize that either. And it threatens to spread, like I said. But having said that, there should already be planning for what happens when the military situation scales down. And colleagues of mine made a very good point. It's probably not going to be one day when the war is over. It's probably not going to be one day of a ceasefire. It may be very slow and incremental drawdowns. We may not exactly know, just as we didn't actually know when the ground operation was beginning, because it was kind of a rolling process under the sort of obscured by, cautiously constrained information. So I think that, first of all, anybody who's interested in the long term certainly should begin thinking, or at least learning, what the options are for, what has to happen the moment the fighting stops, and to try to reach that moment sooner rather than later. Having said that, I think there are two dangers. One is to immediately, try to rush in and say we need the immediate steps to help very, urgent crisis situation, which is, of course, the situation in Gaza, right, with so many people displaced. There aren't enough words to describe, the level of injury and death and destruction in Gaza. So that's going to need immediate attention. But to think about how to set up governing systems, who's going to take care of Gaza, who's going to reconstruct, who's going to provide services, all of that has to happen immediately, but it should not happen aimlessly. So from the start, I think that the actors involved, presumably international actors and Palestinian, need to think, and Israelis, of course, but like I said, I think Israelis shouldn't, I mean, they will in reality have a great deal of control. But they need to think about what they want the long-term vision to look like. And because the structures that are put into place in the earliest days can very easily morph into the long-term structures. And they should be built in a way that will serve a future political resolution, hopefully based on something that is fair and democratic, like a two-state, or I had my preference, something like a two states and a confederated approach. But the kinds of mechanisms and institutions that are established need to be friendly towards a future political resolution from the start, I think. Otherwise, they risk becoming simply kind of emergency services that become permanent. And that's what we've seen over the decades. That's basically how Palestinians have been living in refugee camps for many years, because nobody, thought it was that urgent to reach a political resolution of that issue. So that's one thing. It should happen immediately, but not aimlessly. And the second thing is, I would be cautious about repeating one of what I consider to be the mistakes of what happened in the 1990s, the Oslo process, which there's lots of ways we could analyze it and critique it. But I think one of the things that ultimately turned out to be a mistake, which was thought at the time to be a positive mechanism for moving the process ahead, was this incremental, phased, and conditional approach. And the idea that small steps, each side proves that it sticks to the agreement, and then if you both behave well, then we go to the next stage, and each one is very incremental. That turned out to be not appropriate at that time. I mean, now I think of course, there are going to have to be phases. There will have to be a transitional phase, just to stabilize Palestinian society. But I would be careful about establishing, a vision. If I was talking to policy leaders, which sometimes I am, to think about the idea of a final status political agreement, without naming it, without kind of defining it, without outlining the basic contours of that political agreement, puts one in danger of repeating exactly the same problems all these years, which is that nobody actually agrees on what it is. And then each side just tries to continue creating facts on the ground, primarily Israel, because it has much more political and economic, and military power do those facts, to create those facts on the ground. And that would be the worst trap to fall into all over again.
Do you think the Hamas
sorry,
attack?
sorry, David,
Yes.
I have to jump in. We have a ton of audience questions, and
Okay.
yeah. So so Dalia, thank you so much. Two audience members have asked about Palestinian citizens of Israel. Could you comment a bit about their role or their perspective now?
Yeah, sure. It's a very rich topic. I mean, one of the most interesting things I think is that Palestinian citizens of Israel, feel very much like part of Palestinian society on some level and part of Israeli society on another level. But of course, their relationship with Israel has been very fraught with extremes. They are full citizens, but they have never enjoyed citizen equality. They were not full citizens for the first roughly 20 years of Israel's existence. They were living under martial law, under colonial legislation carried over, implemented by military rule. And they didn't actually technically have citizenship for the first 4 years, and then they had to apply for it once Israel passed its citizenship law. Many of them, it was a long process for the majority of those citizens to become citizens. And once they had it, they had to struggle, mightily, sometimes with the help of certain Israeli Jews for incremental progress towards equality. That's led to a lot of tension over the years, not to mention, of course, economic marginalization, social marginalization, garden variety discrimination. And despite all that, I'm just giving this brief background to explain where we are now, not to get into a full history lesson. But one of the interesting things is that despite that, difficult history, unlike some of the other conflicts where I work, on nationalist conflicts, for example, in former communist countries or in the former Soviet Union, they never really, they never actually established something like a secessionist movement. They never said we want to break away. They always, as a community, sought greater, social and economic integration, and strove for more integration into the political system in order to have an influence through political institutions, whether it was as legislators, right, running parties in elections once they were actually allowed to have independent parties, and eventually, for the first time in 2021, entering the executive branch for real with cabinet by entering the governing coalition, not actually taking ministerial positions. And so that's always been the trajectory. Plus, there's been quite significant progress over the years at the economic and social level, even as Israel became more nationalist and eventually passed key legislation discriminating against Arab citizens by elevating the status of Israeli Jews. So there are these contradictory trajectories going on over time that led, and through all that history, not only was there never anything like a secessionist movement, but we really never had significant violence of any kind between Jews and Arab citizens of Israel, except for with one exception, and that was in May 2022, when there were limited but very, very scary riots between Jewish and Arab citizens, including clashes with police, but between the civilians. And I think that was the real shocking thing for Israeli society. I say all that just to explain that after a conflict of this magnitude that began on October 7th, one of the biggest fears of all of Israeli society was that there would be this, reigniting of the sort of, limited violence that was seen. And it was essentially violence that was, again, mostly limited to kind of street violence, not for the most part, not with actually, live weapons, but that this would absolutely just reignite into something like a complete civil war between Jewish and Palestinian or Arab citizens of Israel. And nothing of the sort happened. Okay, in the end, what happened after, in the days and weeks and months and to this day, is that there has been zero by way of clashes or violence. And there are many, numerous reasons for it that, again, I think we're going to be parsing this for a number of years. One reason is that I think many Arab citizens were, first of all, devastated by what Hamas did. They felt it didn't represent Palestinians, and that it was, I know many Palestinians, by the way, individually, who feel this as well, if they were actually watching and, paying attention to the atrocities that happened and really, internalized that it was an attack targeted against civilians. Many Palestinians individually, and including citizens of Israel, felt like, A, this doesn't represent us as Palestinians, never mind as Muslims. It doesn't represent our cause. And not to mention that there were dozens of Arab victims of Hamas's attack. Many people were just killed on the spot on October 7th. They are Palestinian citizens. Again, I use the terms interchangeably, Palestinian and Arab citizens of Israel, but to distinguish from those living in the West Bank and Gaza. There were Palestinian citizens who were taken hostage. There were Palestinian citizens who were killed on the spot. There were, they were suffering the victimization of Hamas's attack alongside Israeli Jews. So one reason was that they were, many of them were simply, revolted by the attack. Another reason was that they were themselves victims and traumatized. Another reason was that civil society, shared society groups, Jewish Arab dialogue groups, education groups, lots of social groups that have been working together in the non-governmental sphere for years, immediately communicated with one another, got on Zoom calls literally in the evening of October 7th to talk about what each group could do to try to calm their societies and make sure, and how they can mobilize local leaders and community leaders and try to make the case, or themselves mobilize their own activists to go around. I think one of the most prominent is called Standing Together. I think they may have a Canadian friends, Standing Together, and they've really done amazing work. They're grassroots Jewish Arab movement in Israel. They've been working nonstop to try to have community gatherings, to try to distribute leaflets and flyers and messages saying we're all together on this. And it's hard to say any one of these things is the cause, but another thing that needs to be taken into account as a reason is that the police have cracked down on them. There have been sweeping arrests, of people who wrote something wrong on Facebook, or suppression of demonstrations in Arab communities. And because, maybe on the one hand, out of fear that they would distract police attention at a time when, in the early days, when all security forces were mobilized to deal with the South. But then, of course, it very quickly became a matter of simple repression of free speech because they didn't want anybody expressing solidarity with the people in Gaza. Israelis view the people of Gaza as essentially contiguous with Hamas. So there's a level of suppression, repression, from the authorities, fear, but there's also a lot of effort and genuine sentiment of trying to avoid an escalation. And that's all part of what we're seeing in terms of Jewish-Arab relations inside Israel right now.
Thank you. I just want to tell our audience that Dalia has very graciously agreed to stay an extra 15 minutes. So although there's been a deluge of questions, we won't be able to get to all of them. And unfortunately, we will get to at least some of them. I'm a couple of questions were directed towards how soon can we hope a new Israeli government might be formed, or what would it take to bring down the current government, and how important is it for advancing a better situation?
Yeah, I get asked this question about 7 times a day, and I'm asking myself, and every Israeli is asking themselves, I think, a similar question. The thing is, it's very easy to say, oh, Netanyahu's gone, he's out, he'll never be able to survive this. But as we say, does anybody know some Hebrew on this call? Elohim Gadol. Anything is possible. And the reason is that Israel's particular coalition, kind of coalition parliamentary system we have governing coalition. Right now, the original governing coalition that was in place on October 6th had a majority of seats. Okay, they had 64 out of 120 parliamentary seats. And, it would take something pretty big for somebody currently in power to willingly say, I'm giving up on power, after they know that the public is extremely angry at them, right? How could the public not be angry at them? They're seeing the same surveys I'm seeing. And I should emphasize that every single indicator in every single survey, and there have been, by my count, about 35 different surveys that have been published since October 7th, media surveys and other kinds of surveys from think tanks, et cetera, they all show abysmal ratings for the government, whether it's, that they're currently polling at 42 to 44 seats out of 120 altogether, governing coalition, or that Netanyahu's Likud has lost over 40% of its strength. Netanyahu himself is, losing to the closest competitor in a question about who's more suitable to be prime minister by double digits. Every single survey ever since October 7th, more than double digits. I mean, his last survey that came out on Friday, he was at 25%, and his rival was at something like 50. So it could be more than 2 to 1, or I think maybe even 51 at points. So they are not going to give up on power so easily when they know that if there are elections tomorrow, like if a party were to bolt from this coalition, if there were elections tomorrow, they probably wouldn't win. So in that case, why would you want elections early? Now, all of that is just talking about the original coalition. For anybody who doesn't know, shortly after the war began, Israel established a kind of expanded coalition to run what it calls the war cabinet with an additional party that gives it more leeway because there are theoretically more seats in the coalition. So we don't know what's going to happen when the war is over, whatever that means. I say over because we don't really think it's going to be over, might not be over technically for years. There could be an ongoing occupation of Gaza on some level, inside Gaza, even after a ceasefire is called. But at some point, when there's a less intensive phase of the war, we assume the war cabinet might break up and that additional party from kind of a center-right party, which is currently doing best in all of the surveys, that's the party called, we call it in English, National Unity, they might leave the coalition and then they'll be left with the original 64. And then those parties will have to decide if they're going to break up over ideological reasons. For example, many think that the most extreme ultra-nationalist parties in the government before October 7th, that they might be so angry if there's a ceasefire that they would want to leave the government. Possible, but would they really want to give up on power? Okay, and if they do stay in the government, this government could theoretically last for a long time, another year, another 2 years. I mean, technically, we don't have to have elections until 2026. So I don't know, most Israeli governments do not last a full term. So with or without a war, most Israeli governments felt, collapse way before the end of a 4-year term. But I think the real question is the timing, because if elections were held tomorrow, Netanyahu would lose, no question. I feel very confident saying that because there's not been a single survey that shows otherwise, and the gaps are enormous. Again, Netanyahu, his party would be second place by a long shot, if not, probably second place for now, but still, I mean, Gantz's party right now, the National Unity Party, is at points twice as big as his. And his coalition can't stay together because they aren't even getting close. They're barely getting a third of the seats in all polls. But elections are not held today. And so if elections are held, let's say in a year, let's say the government collapses, in about 7 months from now, and then we have a 3-month period of campaign, and then they're held in about 9 months from now, and then another 3 months in a year. It will really depend on the status of the war on some level, because if the government can point to lots of achievements in actually, reaching some sort of aims that it can claim represent a victory, people's attitudes might change over time. Then there's another approach that says people will never forgive this government for October 7th, no matter what. And of course, the government wasn't doing well before the war either. We should remember Israel was deeply, deeply riven by the assault on the Israeli judiciary, and the majority of Israelis did not support that package of reforms designed to undercut the judiciary, and the government had lost its majority in surveys long before, not to this extent. But this coalition is unlikely to survive the next elections. I think that seems pretty clear. Netanyahu is a man of infinite tricks in politics, and and that involved him staying in power. But if elections were held within, I would say if elections are held within 1 year, I don't think he can win. If elections are held within a year and forward, it's not entirely impossible that he could find a path to stay in power, but it's hard for me to say exactly what it is.
Thank you. So a question from Barbara Landau, and there was another question sort of similar. How useful would it be to have more shared society initiatives, more money put into Israelis and Palestinians somehow cooperating in areas such as healthcare, the arts? Someone else asked something similar, how to bring the two societies a little bit closer together, even if the governments are not.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question. You can't bring the two societies together until the war stops. So I think that really people have to understand that the sequencing of this is going to be, if you want Israelis and Palestinians to be able to do anything together, then de facto you are supporting a ceasefire and an end to the war. And if you're not prepared to do that, then there's no point in telling yourself that you're able to support Israeli-Palestinian cooperative activity. Having said that, I think there is an enormous need for this kind of cooperative activity. I would, however, qualify that with what I think it was, well, what I have developed as a kind of critical approach to the sorts of cooperative activity that took place in earlier decades. So in the 1990s, during the Oslo period, there was an understanding that peace had to come from the ground up as well as top down. It was very well-meaning, and there were lots of programs set up involving dialogue groups, get to know you, joint projects, youth, sports, camps, great stuff, except that it didn't really hold the societies together when violence flared again. And so I think what we learned is that the kind of cooperation that is more motivating, especially at a time when there's no trust at all, zero. I mean, like literally zero. In survey research before October 7th, mutual perceptions of trust were in single digits already. Sorry, I have to move again because of battery issues. I've got to plug in. So I apologize just for getting up for a second. But I think that, the model that has to be understood now that people need to realize is that cooperation needs to be based, I think it should be based on where the societies actually need each other. Okay, one final motion movement. Yeah, I ran out of battery on the other side. And where the societies actually need each other is where they have shared concerns, shared, day-to-day life needs, infrastructural needs, the kinds that you mentioned. I'm particularly interested in the issue of health, cooperation, for example, on health issues, because it's so obvious. We have an enormous raging health crisis, public health crisis in Gaza because of the war, and it's going to be a public health crisis that ultimately affects Israel. I shouldn't need to make the case at all. We all learned it during Corona. The epidemiological issue does not know political boundaries. The coronavirus doesn't know political boundaries. To my mind, it seems like, very obvious that there needs to be permanent kinds of cooperative bodies that deal with these things so that they're in place, so their relationships are built, practice, the kinds of best practices and protocols are in place, so that when there are crises, you have people who are invested in the cooperation for the sake of both of their actual needs. And then they can, presumably have a better chance of withstanding the political crises. So I think that these kinds of cooperative activities are extremely valuable if they are understood in the context of a political framework that both reflects these mutual needs and supports them, which is again why I support two states in a confederated approach, because then you have more built-in kind of organic understanding of cooperation and the physical capacity to do it, right? The ability to move freely and meet people. And remember, a lot of the kinds of joint activities that did manage to kind of survive all of the more recent, years of stagnation in the peace process, it was very hard for them to function already because of movement restrictions, because Palestinians are not able to get to most of the areas where Israelis can get, and not, Israelis can't always get to area. Certainly, they're not supposed to go into Area A, so you have to find a place in Area B in the West Bank. If people don't know these terms, then, I wish I had time to explain them all, but these are the invisible kind of political bureaucratic lines on the ground that really do mean a lot. They keep people apart. They not only keep Israelis and Palestinians apart, as we know, they kept Gaza isolated. They kept Palestinians apart from one another. So I think we need a political framework that allows for this kind of cooperation. That's why I think it should be two states in a more, confederated association, in order to support the kinds of desperately needed people-to-people cooperation, not just peacefully for its own sake, but to actually address things like climate and environment and health that I don't think should be controversial. I mean, of course they're controversial, but the need for them should be quite obvious.
Okay, thank you. We're almost out of time. We'll only have time for one more question. Before we get to that, I just have a couple of quick things to say. One is another reminder for those of you who feel moved to support us. We would be very grateful for any donation, and you can do that on our website. I also wanted to mention again Dalia's book for those of you who are interested. We will be sending a follow-up notice about the recording, and then that's when we will put the information about your publisher, Dalia. But anyway, her new book, The Crooked Timber, is extremely interesting and we suggest you find it. I'm sorry, I should have the full name on my fingertips, but
That's okay. I'm
why don't
happy
you
to say it. It's The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled.
Right, right. And one other little thing I wanted to mention is we had two co-sponsors helping us promote this event. New Israel Fund of Canada, we're very appreciative, and Amenu Canada. Also, thank you very much, Amenu. And they mentioned that you were an alumnus of Habonim Dror. So
Not an alum, I'm a proud alum.
proud alumnus. Good. Okay. All right. So there are so many questions. But I'm going to go back to because a couple of them have come up, and that is people wondering just Israel's enormous reaction, military reaction in Gaza. Is the destruction in Gaza, can it be explained or can it be justified by the need to degrade Hamas, or do you feel that Israel went overboard? And what about humanitarian aid? Can Israel do more to facilitate humanitarian aid in Gaza?
Yeah. Sorry. So for one thing, I hate to, pull the old, I'm not an expert thing, especially, especially women should never do that. But I really am not a military analyst. It's not my expertise. And so I do defer to people who are inside the room, either on military decisions or have had that experience. However, I will say that from the beginning of October 7th, this was an active military attack on Israeli sovereign territory and civilians. There was no way not to have a strong military response. First and foremost, to stop the attack. The attack was ongoing. I think people also need to realize that as much as, we've all become much more consumed by the level of devastation in Gaza, and rightfully so, but at the moment you couldn't, there was no way for any sovereign state to say we're not going to have a military response. That should be understood. It was an ongoing active military attack. It was an ongoing active military attack inside Israeli sovereign territory because the operatives who came in, I'm not necessarily talking about those who spontaneously came in, but they fanned out throughout the country, certainly throughout the South. They brought equipment with them to stay. They were planning on staying and committing further attacks. And so, the source of this absolutely had to be attacked militarily. I think the question is proportionality. And the real argument is, has Israel been disproportionate in its response, and has it been discriminating, trying to protect civilian lives? And I think, that's, to my mind, absolutely, it has not gone far enough in trying to protect civilians. To my mind, right, looking at the level of civilian destruction, Israel has, for the first few weeks, carried out, such a massive air campaign that, I think the pace of civilian death was something like, unprecedented, or I don't know about entirely unprecedented, but certainly out of scale with many of the other conflicts we've seen in the world. So it's easy for me to say, let me put this differently. I think the level of civilian death in Gaza is intolerable, and the level of destruction of civilian life. Nothing is easy for me to say. I think that should be clear as well. I don't want to pretend that I have all the answers. But it definitely seems like there was, well, not just seems, it's been documented that the Israeli army's own practices for how it normally does try to distinguish civilians and, to try to protect civilians from becoming their targets, that the army itself and Israeli officials even said that many of these practices were being pushed aside or, neglected. So somewhere between neglecting and actively targeting, I think, is a big gap. But I don't think the Israeli army has done enough, because by its own admission, there's been documentation for anybody who hasn't read it. There's an excellent investigative report on 972 magazine by Yuval Avraham, with lots of, military sources saying we really aren't paying attention to those kinds of protections too much right now. So that kind of thing never should have happened. And I think that in terms of humanitarian aid, the idea of using humanitarian aid as a weapon is frankly a violation of international law. It's collective punishment. And it is by definition harming people who are not responsible for either what happened on October 7th or for Hamas, for that matter, just civilians. And there are civilians who are not implicated in any of that. And it doesn't meet the standards of human decency, to my mind, to say we're going to deny an entire population of food, water, fuel, and medicine. wreck their hospitals and health services. And in terms of the question of bombing targets like hospitals, well, the list of targets that sound like civilian targets is very long. Hospitals, mosques, schools, churches. I don't think anybody should bury their head in the sand. Hamas has been very deeply embedded in this, in civilian infrastructure, and by all accounts, from what we're hearing, and I don't think this can be written off as propaganda. IDF is going house to house and finding lots of weapons in each house. But I do think there's a lot more that could have been done to, again, employ proportionality and discriminate, and be more discriminating about the targets. Again, based on documented admissions of military officials, and the idea of weaponizing civilian well-being certainly crosses every line, I think, and should never have been a policy. And the displacement of mass numbers of people, which theoretically, as Israel argued in The Hague the other day, could have been a form of protection had Israel not then subsequently bombed some of the evacuation routes and then the areas where they were supposed to be safe. And so then you're left to decide whether there was a just cause for bombing those areas. And that's where my knowledge ends. I'm not going to listen to people who are mouthing off about it without knowing, because I don't know the intelligence information, but I can say that if you're telling people to move to a safe area and then bombing that area, that's probably, a significant violation and should not be the policy.
Thank you, Dalia. Thank you, everyone. We have so many good questions. I'm sorry to say, I apologize that I could not get to them all, or even a small portion. We also apologize for not actually mentioning your names with some of the questions, but again, it was in order to try to get more of them in. We need to wrap things up. So thank you so much, Dalia, for giving us so much of your time, expertise, perspective, your unflinching views and understanding. You've enriched us in many ways. I want to let the audience know that we will be sending a follow-up notice about the recording, and also I'll put some links to some of Dalia's articles. She's written a lot, as you can read more about what she has said. And thank you, David, for your great questions and moderating. Thank you again, all of you, for viewing, and stay tuned for future webinars.
Can I take a moment to thank all of you for hosting me, for joining in the audience, and the organizations who sponsored this. And I also took a quick look at the questions as fast as I could read them, and they're great questions. So I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but I will think about them.
Yes, it is unfortunate, but time is what it is. So we wish you well, Dalia, and I just want to say that when I say goodbye and we turn this off, I'll be gone. We'll both be gone. So, Laila Tov, keep up your good work. Thank you.
Laila Tov, toda raba.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.